back to another video. My name is Mike Brown, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about accounts receivable. But to start with, we should probably define some of the key attributes of receivables, and I would say there are 4. So let's start with number 1. What distinguishes an accounts receivable from other receivables in one big way is it's an oral promise. Now, the best definition to kind of say why is that different is to say, well, a note receivable is a written promise. This is an oral promise. Second, it's classified as a current asset. Other receivables might be classified as long-term, but accounts receivable is going to be a current asset. Third, it can come from a couple of different sources. Oftentimes you'll hear accounts receivable referred to as trade receivables. Trade simply means this was generated from customers in the kind of ordinary course of business. There can be other accounts receivable, though. We would give that the very creative name of non-trade, and that covers everything else. And then finally, how do we measure accounts receivable? Well, we use the concept called net realizable value. Now, in a perfect universe, that's whatever was the amount owed, right? That would be the amount you'd collect. But we know better. It doesn't always happen that way. For one thing, we may offer a discount on the amount. We may encourage faster payment by giving a little bit off. Or we may decide that we have a receivable we're not going to collect, and so we write it off as uncollectible. Or we may have a customer that returns some of the goods we sold them as non-conforming, and so we credit that back against their account. That's net realizable value. It is taking the amount originally owed, the gross amount, but then subtracting for some of these items that can affect how much we ultimately collect, that we ultimately realize. Now, before we dive too deeply into receivables, I want to bring up a technique, or really a pair of techniques that you can use not just for receivables problem. We just think they're a great way to illustrate this, but you can use it on any number of exam questions. It's referred generally as account analysis, and I'm going to give you 2 different techniques. Now, let me start by saying this. You're not obligated to use one of these 2. You may decide one works better than the other. Perfect, then that's the one you should use. You may say, well, actually, Mike, I learned in college a third way to do it, and it really makes a lot of sense, and I've always done it that way. If it works, stick with it. You're not obligated to follow one of our ideas. What is underlying this, though, is the need to have a method to organize a block of information, typically multiple numbers, such that you can solve specifically for what the question's asking you to do. Now, the first technique is my favorite. It's called the base mnemonic. And just like baseball, that's the illustration we're going to use here. So we start at home plate. That's where you're batting. We call that the B. That's the beginning balance, where we start the period. After we hit the ball, we're going to start moving around the bases. We're going to go to first base. That's the A. That's additions. That's anything that's going to add to the account in that period. We round first, head to second. Now we've got the S, subtractions. That's anything that's going to reduce the balance during that period. Now we head to third base, the E. That's the ending balance, right? Once we've taken the beginning balance plus all additions minus all subtractions, we're going to end up with the ending balance. But I love the fact that then where do you go from third? You go back home, because the ending balance then becomes the beginning balance for the subsequent period. All right. Now, what I find is that some folks say, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. Some folks say, it seems like a lot of extra work. Some folks say, well, it sounds like a T account, and I like T account, so why don't we do that next? So a T account is just another visual way to represent that same information. So let's use accounts receivable here as an illustration. Now, AR normally has a debit balance. That's the left side. So we're going to go ahead and write the B first. That's the beginning balance. Now, things that add, in this case, the A's from base, will be on the same side because they're going to increase that balance. There's really only one, credit sales. At least that's the big one. That's what's going to generate new receivables. All right, continue around. Let's deal with S. What's going to take away from this? And we just mentioned this previously, that net realizable value includes ideally what we're going to collect. So that's the big thing that's going to remove from this balance are cash collections, but not the only thing. One possibility is we end up writing off the receivable. So that's another thing that could reduce the balance. Also, we might convert it. We may decide that given the customer's financial hardship, we decide, you know what, we get it. You're not going to be able to pay this promptly, but we know you want to pay it. So we're going to write you a note receivable to lay out some new terms so you can repay it over time. Well, that still removes the account receivable. It just gets rid of that in favor of a note receivable instead. Once we've got all the S's accounted for, we head to third base, right? That's the E. So that's going to be my ending balance, and that's simply adding up the normal side, that's the debit side in this case, and subtracting the credits. We end up with a new ending balance, and that would carry on as my beginning balance for the subsequent period. Now, once again, you're not obligated to use either of these, but if you find one intuitively makes sense and helps you organize the information in a given question, let's see it in action with an illustration. So let's walk through a scenario for accounts receivable. Here's how I'm going to lay this one out. We're going to use the base mnemonic structure this time. What do we need? B. I need the beginning balance. Let's say that was $90,000. We brought into the period $90,000 in outstanding accounts receivable. Next is the A. What adds? Typically credit sales. Let's say we had a robust month. We actually sold $800,000 on account. We'll do a subtotal. That means we've now got $890,000 on the debit side if we were talking T accounts. Now we'll deal with the subtractions, and I mentioned 3 just a moment ago. The big one, the one we want, is cash collections. We'll say that's $810,000. We collected a big chunk of it. We did have to write off some bad debts, though. Some receivables we said, yeah, unfortunately, we're not going to collect that. Let's say that's $23,000. And then we had one customer who owed us $7,000, which we made an arrangement to pay using a note receivable. So that was an AR that was converted to a note receivable. Now, if we add up all the subtractions, that's $840,000. So 890 minus 840 leaves us with our ending balance, $50,000. And that's the balance we would carry into the next period. So one piece I haven't brought into the picture that, how would this show up on the exam? Well, for the examiners, it's pretty simple. Pull a number. They're going to take something out, and that's what the question is going to ask you. So imagine it looks like this. What were the sales for the period? So instead of that $800,000, in your base mnemonic, as you're working through the problem, you're going to have a blank space or a question mark. That's the number you have to solve for. Or it could be solve for the cash collections in the period. This time, it's the $810,000 that disappears. Or it could even be, what's the ending balance? So they take away that $50,000. Regardless, the method that you use works, and all you have to do once you've finished organizing the information is to figure out, okay, what piece is missing and what do I need to do to solve for that missing piece. And that's the value in these different tools, is really about organizing the information in a way that makes it easy to highlight what you're trying to solve for. All right, folks, that gives us a pretty good foundation to deal with accounts receivable and allows us now to jump into one of the most important issues surrounding receivables, which is valuation. So I will see you in the next video to discuss that.